Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Material Matters, hosted by me, Grant Gibson. In each podcast, we're meeting a maker, a designer or architect who is intrinsically linked to a particular material or technique, discovering how their craft shaped their lives and careers. It gives me huge pleasure to kick off this series by talking to Bill Amberg, renowned leather designer, best known for his bags, of course, but also for his work with architects. Recent projects have included the extension of the RA with David Chipperfield Architects and the extraordinary Queen's Jubilee Galleries in Westminster Abbey. Bill, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello there. It's very exciting to be involved in the first ever production of the Grant Gibson podcast.
Oh, well, that's my distinct pleasure. Thank you. Well, should we kick off straight away with the obvious question is, you're known for leather. How did your relationship with leather begin?
It was a kind of a curious material choice, I guess. I grew up near Northampton. My mother was a designer, worked for Alvar Aalto, and she and my father had a lift and escalator business in Northampton called the Express Lift Company. So I was kind of surrounded by designing and making, I guess, from an early age. And not being particularly good at school, but being keen on designing and making things and very much encouraged by my parents. They got me involved in all sorts of things, metalwork, woodwork, etc. My grandfather, who lived at home as well, and my father both had a workshop each. So they were keen making things. And my mother used to go to Northampton Market and get bags of leather scrap and bring them back home for us to mess around with.
How did your mum end up leaving Finland and Aalto for Northampton, I wonder?
Love, yeah. Fell in love with my dad. And they'd met in London before, and then when my mother moved to Finland to go and work for Aalto, I think my father kept up a fairly constant barrage of love letters, wooed her home. And there you go.
Very good. So, being from Northampton, was it always going to be leather in that case?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, it wasn't. It was literally something I played with as a boy. I mean, we're talking kind of, I suppose, sort of 10 to 14 years old, and it was amongst lots of other materials. But then after school, I decided I wanted to go travelling. I funded that with a stint on the oil rigs in the North Sea. And then when I got abroad, it was starting in New Zealand and basically working my way back, it was always something I could do. And leatherwork was just one of my skills. But it did mean that every town I went to, I could look up the cobbler or the saddler or the whatever.
Can I take you back a moment? Because did you learn to make things at school? Was leather part of the curriculum?
Not in the curriculum, but there was one teacher at school who did do leather classes, which I did, which was a way of getting out of games, and that seemed to work for me. So, yeah, I mean, I was kind of interested, but I also did woodwork and metalwork and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, and it kind of, as it just grew as a material, and as I did more and more of it on my travels, I just became more intrigued with it. But I worked for like everybody, saddlers, cobblers, hippie sandal makers, hippie belt makers, all kinds of stuff. But it was intriguing. And then when I got to Adelaide, very strangely, my cousin, who's Australian, was teaching leatherwork, completely weird coincidence, at Canberra School of Art. And she introduced me to a lady called Gay Wilson in some studios in Adelaide called the Jam Factory, which I believe is still going. And I worked for her as an apprentice. And that was extraordinary. And she taught me enormous amounts.
So what kind of age were you at this point?
I was 19, 20.
And how come you didn't go to university? Was that never on the agenda?
Yeah, I never got the results that would have got me into any university.
And so the obvious step then is to go on to oil rigs.
Well, I needed some cash, and I think, and I was quite adventurous. And of course then, this is 1979, I guess, the oil boom was happening and the oil rigs were a big draw. It was something that was around and being spoken about, and so it just seemed like a good idea. So I just went up there with my hold all full of kit and booked into the YMCA or was it YMCA? Yeah, YMCA in Aberdeen.
Okay. So I'm digressing because I need to know more about Gay and what was her studio like.
So the Jam Factory was a really interesting bunch of studios. They had glass, ceramics, weaving, lots of jewellers, and it was a really big and well set up studio. It was an exciting place to be. And Gay was making, at that stage, she was making bespoke jockeys' boots, some wallets and belts, some custom bags for people. So I just kind of started helping her, but she taught me really rigorously the fundamentals of leather technique. But she was very experimental herself and had no particular boundaries as to what you could do with the material, and was fascinated by everything that was going on around. So I was very involved in talking to ceramicists, talking to glass blowers, and there were lots of different ceramicists, from fine bone china to huge terracottas. Everybody was there making different things.
And were you able to do your own stuff while you were there?
Yeah, I did. I started to do my own stuff with her, and that involved there was a visit from a Canadian, I think he's Canadian, a guy called Rex Lingwood, who's a sculptor, a leather sculptor, and that was quite inspiring because he was doing wet molded leather. And so that kind of got me going down a path. And then I started to make jewellery pieces, or sculptural jewellery pieces. And that led to an exhibition where I put on and I was making breastplates and neck pieces and,
Was there a huge market for those?
No. No. But, I sold a few things, and it was interesting trying, and it was curious times. I mean, it was, I was getting paid for my work, and with Gay, and, it was cheap. It was a cheap place to live. But I learned an enormous amount. It set me on my way. Then when I went off to Southeast Asia after Australia, I then went specifically to look at a few leather workers who were around and started to learn a bit more.
So you definitely decided by this stage that leather was going to be your career?
Well, yeah, sort of. I mean, it was just it was something I was very interested in. But when I came back to England, that pretty much kicked it off, because when I got back to England, in, I guess, 83, I guess, my dad sort of said, "What are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "Well, leather, obviously." And I kind of thought, "Oh, okay." And that's when I found out about the Waterside Workshops, which are down in Rotherhithe Street, which was a cooperative set of studios. And I started down in there, got a tiny little studio. Through Dad's connections in Northampton with the shoe industry guys, I got hold of a sewing machine and a skive machine, and just started. But I realised pretty obviously that I wasn't going to be able to start doing sculptural jewellery in leather. But thought I'd do bags because it seemed like a good commercial way of using my skills, and started pretty well straight away. I went to Liberty's straight away, and for whatever reason they took a collection of bags that I'd designed and made. Then I had the same thing with Paul Smith. I went to see Paul Smith, and he pretty well straight away took collection bags. And then I continued with Paul Smith for years, nearly 10 years, designing and making all their bags.
It sounds kind of frictionless. You come to London, you walk into Liberty's.
It was very lucky.
This happen?
It was very lucky. It was just good timing. And I think London in the 80s was cheap, very active, good fun. There was great music going on. There's lots of people involved. All those characters like Tom Dixon and Andre Dubroy and Mark Brazier-Jones and all those guys were making things. Ron Arad.
And were you working with them at the time?
I was doing, but I wasn't working with them. I knew them all, but everybody was around. And then NATO. I started the first architectural job. I was good friends with architects, and Nigel Coates had a group of architects called NATO, and Narrative Architecture Today, and I did a project with them for an exhibition, and Ron bought the table for his gallery then. And
how were you meeting these people?
Just socially, just mates. They were just mates. There was a quite an interesting squat in Vauxhall. There was that in Bonington Square, and there was quite a lot of guys around there. So it was an interesting, and they were all teaching at the AA as well. So I got involved in that a little bit.
Did you always have an interest in architecture?
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. I mean, Mum was really passionate about it, as was Dad. I mean, it was always talking about it, and our house was, Mum designed it, Dad built it, basically.
And was there always an ambition to combine leather with architecture in that case?
I think what was interesting, and I kind of looking back on it, it didn't happen, certainly wasn't planned. I mean, none of my career's been planned, but I think just looking back on it, it was quite, Gay had really exposed me to lots of different techniques. She was always messing up with techniques, mixing up stuff. And the more you realise about leatherwork itself is that it is this, it's got quite a formal technical structure to many different elements. So bookbinding, saddlery, shoemaking, case making, all of these things have their own techniques. And historically, those techniques are quite, they hold fast to their own individual, avenue. But I was very interested in all of them. I was interested in learning a little bit about bookbinding and doing some saddlery and making shoes, making jockey's boots. I was making whips, plaited stock whips and stuff, hand stitching wallets, all these things. And so you suddenly sort of realise, hey, hang on a minute, I'm touching all of these elements of this rather wonderful craft. And so you start to build up quite a big repertoire of stuff. And that put me outside of the normal leather industry, I guess, because I wasn't a bookbinder and I wasn't a shoemaker and I wasn't a saddler. But I was interested in all of it. And then coupled with an interest in architecture, you can start to think about all of those things in scale. And that's what I find interesting, is to take those technical things and expand them, explode them onto a bigger scale. So you suddenly start to think about the scale of a building or the scale of an interior, and then what can you use, where would you use it? And that also is reflected in the material choice as well as the technique that you might be using.
So can we talk about what it is you love about leather?
Leather really is the most fantastic material to work with. I mean, it's a very sympathetic material as soon as you start working with it. It can do extraordinary things. I mean, I think as a material, there's an enormous array of different types of material. Most people's association with leather is a car interior or a sofa or something. In fact, there are every type of material, particularly the sort of vegetable tanned variety, which I absolutely love, which is saddlery material. And it's a kind of, when I say it's benign, I mean, it's a byproduct for a start. It's a sustainable byproduct of a material. So you're working in this very benign space. If people stopped eating meat, there would be no leather industry. We don't use anything here that hasn't been eaten. That's a sort of given. And I think when you start to work it, just the way it really helps you along, you're not fighting with it ever. It contracts as much as it expands. It's moldable when it's wet. You can play with every different type of sheen, touch, finish, handle, All of those things are variable. Lots and lots of variables with it. And that's what makes it an exciting thing to work with. And again, I think architecturally, it's really intriguing for those reasons. There's so many variables in terms of texture and finish and colour and ways of colouring it. And that's before you even start on, the different natural grains of a goat skin, a sheep skin, a cow, a bull, a buffalo, an ostrich. They're all completely different. So there's a huge variety of stuff that you can play with.
So can I ask how the business has changed over the years? I mean, obviously you have your bags, Liberties and Paul Smith, you're doing stuff with NATO. And how did you combine those two different threads of the business?
Well, then it was quite muddled in a way. I mean, there was no planning, but I was by and large making bags. It was an accessories business, and I started doing, one project a year. I mean, I did my first leather floor in 1986, which is still down now. It's a really, really beautiful, beautiful floor.
Where is that?
In Thurlow Square.
Right.
A house in Thurlow Square. It's absolutely beautiful. And then, then the next year it was like 2 projects, and the next year it was 3 projects, and so on. So it just kind of built very slowly in parallel. Meanwhile, the bag business was growing really, really well, and particularly in Japan.
And you had your own shops, obviously.
Yeah,
when did that happen?
I think people ask that. I can't really remember that well. I guess in the sort of mid-90s, I opened my first store in Notting Hill. Again, when Notting Hill was a different sort of place, it was much more artisanal than it is now. All the antique shops were still along Westbourne Grove, and it was a bit more of a funky place. But yeah, I opened my first shop there. They opened a shop in New York. We had a shop in Nolita, which was fantastic. We were doing lots of business in Japan. We had quite a growing business. And then the architectural business at that stage also was getting larger, but it was very much the second fiddle to the accessories business.
So when did you start employing people, and what kind of problems does that present, I wonder, for a maker?
Well, the first person I employed was my sister, because I still am rubbish at numbers and writing, organising, but she was very, very organised. So she did all that side of the business. And then I also had some. I then got help in the studio as well. I got other craftspeople coming in, specifically for bags. That is, so they were doing machining and what have you for the bags, and that kind of slowly grew. And then also in about 1990, I went to, quite by chance, London Business School for a year. They had quite an inspired course at the London Business School called the Firm Start Programme, which was for existing companies. You had to have an existing company, but they taught you everything that you need to know about running a business. And that was really interesting. And especially from my point of view, because I never thought I'd go to university or anything like that. So it kind of was like very cool to suddenly be able to go to a business school. But it was fascinating. And that really kind of revolutionised my thinking about how to run the business and what the business should be and how it should work. And
so that's interesting. So how did it change?
No, just kind of through structural things and some basic understandings of what makes a business tick. It also really led me into export. It really got me going into exporting. So I did a lot of trade fairs. Obviously these are men's fashion trade fairs primarily. And it made the business profitable. It made the business make some money, which is previously it was just completely hand to mouth. Mm. And that kind of focus is quite useful. Suddenly when you're beginning to make some money, it's quite exciting. It's not all such a grind, or at least the grind has a purpose rather than just being a grind.
I mean, was there a point you were exporting to Japan, you had shops in the States, in London, etc. The architecture practice or side of the work was going well. I mean, did you still have time to make? Do you make now?
Well, then that was interesting actually, because in about, I guess, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I guess towards the end of that period, around the 2000s, I wasn't making enough. And I got really disillusioned with the whole thing and found the whole thing really, really tedious, actually. And just found myself becoming a businessman, which was never my intention. And in fact, then what I did is, the first thing I did is I built a big workshop at my house in my garden, and that's still standing, and it's still very much a kind of, haven for me where I can go and make stuff. And that proved to be, sort of for my mental health, that proved to be really useful, because then I had my own personal little studio where I could go and explore things and make things and experiment again. And in fact, it really helped the business, because then I started to come back into work and with experimental pieces for people to, develop and make up. And I think that it really helped a lot. And I still hold to that now. I've since then I've employed carefully people to run the business for me, so that I really do stay on the making and designing side. And I still love my workshop at home. It's great. It's a really nice place to go and, play and develop things.
The studio, how do you structure it? How does it work, I wonder?
Well, when I used to go to Japan, I was very influenced by Yanagi. And there's a fantastic book called The Unknown Craftsman, which is about the importance of making, principally, and about how beautiful things are improved by continually making them. And that I find I really think that's important. And consequently, I have built the studio around the workshop. So the workshop is central to everything. Everybody involved in accounts, sales, design, everything. They have to walk through, associate with people making things all the time. And that's vital. And it engages everybody. And it really engages the way people think about the business. And this is really crucial for everything that we do. We have experimental days about every 6 weeks, I suppose, where everybody gets to put an idea in the hat, anybody from any area of the business. And then once we decide what we're going to do, everybody has a go at making that one thing. So it could be weaving, it could be braiding, it could be moulding, it could be, all of this, the stack desk came out of it, the structural leatherwork came out of it. All of these ideas get developed on these experimental days. And that kind of, that informs a lot of the thinking. And then there's cross-training. So we do a lot of cross-training, because people will have, people will follow down a specific line. You'll suddenly get somebody who just really gets into hand stitching. And then I just really actively encourage them to get into hand stitching. We'll get somebody else who's really good at braiding now, loves braiding. So on certain days, we'll have cross-training days where that person will then teach everybody everything that they know about braiding or everything they know about hand stitching or wet moulding, and I do that. I teach I do the wet moulding, I do the braiding. I'm pretty good at both of those things. But that really helps too. So you get this kind of energy of making and of excellence, which I think is really important.
Obviously, there's loads of talk about further education courses closing down, there being a crisis in making education. Do you find it easy to find people to work with you?
I do find it easy to find people, only because I think now we do represent a very interesting studio to a lot of people. And we get a lot of CVs. We get a lot of people wanting to come and work here.
With what kind of skills?
Well, all sorts. Even now we've got, we've got we've got a bookbinder, we've got a furniture maker, we've got an architect, we've got a guy from fashion retail. They're all working here and loving it. And so I don't look out for people who come from fashion colleges anymore. I just don't find them necessarily being the people who have broad enough understanding of what we're about. I mean, because that's what I need. I need people who have a real desire to explore.
Well, on that theme of exploration, last year's London Design Festival, you launched this kind of digitally printed leather. Can we talk about why you did that and the technology behind that?
Well, that is interesting because it's a strange thing for me, because I've never sold anything I haven't made before. So that was kind of curious in itself. But it did strike me that the technology was there and being underutilized. And I'm very interested in technology. I think mixing technology and craft, I think is really intriguing. And I like to see it now. I like seeing people using CNCing and then overlaying it with handwork. And, I think, well, why not? It's completely valid. And also I was very quick to start using vacuum formed plastics and stuff like that within my bags. But if I couldn't pull a shape or make a shape or get a shape, I would, create a skeleton and then pull the leather over it. And I suppose that kind of thinking was new, and using castings, using aluminium castings and things within bags and stuff. So I was already there in terms of, like, when these pieces of technology came along, I was really keen to latch hold of them. And the same with laser cutting. We were doing a lot of laser cutting very early on, and CNC. We do a lot of CNC stuff. We've really developed that a lot now. Working leather over a CNC'd shape. And I think when I started to see digital printed leather, it's really interesting. It was a really interesting idea, but not done well. That was the thing that kind of irked me. Everybody had a print idea, but nobody did it properly. And again, I was interested in it in scale. I wanted to see it in scale. I mean, you can work well on a 1 foot square panel. You can do something quite interesting with leather and printing, but I wanted to see it in scale, because I think that's when you start to see things in a different way. And so I started talking to one of the tanneries that we work very closely with about whether we could develop a leather specifically to accept the digital print. So rather than just printing on a piece of leather, let's forget about the print and really focus in on the leather itself, on the tannage, and make a tannage purely for the printing process, and then look at each individual colour within the printing process and work on those individual colours in relation to the leather, so that the leather and that one colour is compatible across the CMYK range. And it took 2 and a bit years to develop. And then when it came out, it was like, wow, this is fantastic. And then what are we going to do with it? So then I spoke to friends of mine, all designers who I'd worked with and who I liked their work, and also who I knew would come at it, intellectually from a nice point of view, and look at it and think, this could be interesting. So Tom Dixon, Faye Toogood, Natasha Baradan, Timorous Beasties, and Alexandre Champalimo all came up with designs, all quite different. And then we launched it at the Design Festival.
So, kind of final question, really. I mean, where do you see the future of the studio?
We've got a really beautiful project in 160 Aldersgate, where we've been asked to design and make all of the main reception furniture, which is a great project. And we've come up with some really interesting ideas that I think are being pushed along at the moment. And that'll be quite new, and there'll be big pieces. We've also got another big project in the city where we were asked to design, and now we're making the main reception lobby walls and ceiling area. So that's another really interesting project. We've been exploring how we can work with structural leather, using leather structurally, and that's going to be really interesting. We've now developed another piece of furniture around that, so that'll be quite interesting. So yeah, it's going to be an exciting year, I think, and a new studio. We've got to move studios, which is a shame.
Oh gosh.
This street has been bought by a new landlord, and I don't think they want makers here anymore, which is a shame. Reflection on London making life, I fear.
Yes, well, that sounds like it's a subject for another podcast. I think we are going to literally watch this space in that case. Yeah. Bill, thank you so much for being our first guest. I really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure, Grant. Thanks you.